Hello, Pastor Rob here. I am recording this Thursday morning, and it's 2 days after the shooting at the elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. Member of our church reached out to me and asked if I would say something about what happened, and just offer some thoughts. And I'll be honest with you, there was on the one hand, I wanted to sort of jump on the opportunity to say something, but I also I found myself really procrastinating and not wanting to sort of do anything, because I'm like a lot of you probably, where you just aren't sure what to say or what to think about everything. You in some ways, we become numb to this. It happens so frequently, and it's become, unfortunately, such a frequent occurrence. And so there's this whole range of emotions. There's the grief and the sadness of just even trying to imagine what it would be like to send your kid off to a place that's supposed to be safe and protected, and to hear the news that there's been a shooting and there are 14, 15, 19, 21 people killed. The stories of a sheriff's deputy responding to the call and finding out that his daughter was one of the victims. The pain of that and just the horror of that is really beyond words. And I want to avoid the trap of cliches and simple answers and so on. How do we make sense of this? How do we try to sort through it? There's pain, there's sadness, there's anger, there's a strong desire to do something. If I scrolled through on my social media post, and there's a ton of different calls for action, and people post their opinions and their convictions about what to do or what not to do. Do we push for gun control? Do we not push for gun control because that's not really the problem? Do we advocate for better school safety, arm the teachers, take our kids out of the public schools, homeschool them, push for mental health? I mean, there's all these different ideas and solutions. I'm going to make a very, very brief comment on this, and then I'm actually not going to say much in terms of what I think the sort of these solutions are. I'm not a policy expert. I'm not an expert in terms of social problems and social issues. I have opinions, but I'm not really going to delve too much into that. I think Christians can and should, according to their conscience, act. I think that's appropriate. I would suggest that often the problems are more complicated or than they might first appear, and there's cultural values and things that are at play that are not easily corrected and changed. There's the fact that we can look at symptoms thinking that we're addressing the underlying causes when really we're not. What I want to do, so there's sort of my comment on that. What I want to do is maybe just ask ourselves the question, where do we go in scripture that maybe gives a voice to what we're experiencing, and how might that help navigate through this? One of the things that I'm going to actually just, one of the things that comes up is the theme of lament. Psalm 10 is one of these laments, and it's striking to me how often in the Bible lament comes up. Something like 1/3 of all the Psalms are Psalms of lament, Psalms in which we cry out to God in sadness or anger or frustration, and even accusing God of not doing enough. And for many of us, that is that's a prayer we're not used to praying. We're sort of taught that when you pray to God, you be nice. You don't speak the harsh truth that you might have in your heart. You certainly don't accuse God, and yet the psalmist does exactly that. So I'm going to just pull this up on my screen, and I want to just make a couple of observations here. Let me do it this way. You should be able to see Psalm 10 here. And I'm going to just, as I said, I'm going to just make a couple of little observations. You first here, I think this captures what so many of us actually feel, which is, why do you stand so far away? And why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Now, that's a bold accusation to make of God, that he's distant and he's removed, and in the very moment that we need him more than anything else, he's hiding. That's the first observation. That's an appropriate, heartfelt, honest prayer, and it's appropriate because it assumes covenant relationship with God. It assumes that we have the freedom to speak to God. We have the freedom to express ourselves to God, and that God should do something about that. So lament is sort of built on this idea of covenant, that if there was no relationship, you couldn't have the freedom to speak in this way. So I think that's one of the things that is helpful and beneficial for us to learn, and that is to lament. And so for those of us that are kind of experiencing this profound grief and sadness, it's appropriate to acknowledge that grief in prayer. It's appropriate to pray that to God in prayer. The second thing that I want to just make an observation about, or really it's the second place that the psalmist goes. Let's first get rid of the first drawing. The second thing that the psalmist does is he actually diagnoses what is the real problem. And really this goes rather long in the psalm. Beginning in verse 2, and you can see it goes all the way down here through about verse 11. So the drawing doesn't exactly match it perfectly, but it's really from 2 verses 11. The psalmist describes what he sees as the problem, and there's a couple things that are striking, and I think it just sort of captures. There's a couple things that I just wanted to show you that I think describe exactly what happened. It's you hear these words here. He sits in the village, in hiding places he murders the innocent. His eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. He lurks in ambush like a lion in his thicket. He lurks that he might seize the poor. He seizes the poor when he draws them into his net. They are helpless. The helpless are crushed, sink down, and fall by his might. I sense that's an accurate, if poetic, description of what happened at that school in Uvalde on Tuesday. Murdering the innocent, watching for the helpless, lurking like a lion, seizing the poor, and the helpless are crushed down, they sink down, and they fall. That's the power of evil in our world today, and I think Psalm 10 describes that quite well. We can kind of look for a whole bunch of different motivations as to why, what would prompt a person to do that. What the psalmist says is what the psalmist says here, and the way the psalmist categorizes it, is this is a problem of the human heart. It's a problem of just the depths of brokenness and sinfulness and the power that sin has over us. The wicked boasts of the desires of his soul. Just look at a couple of these things that the psalmist writes about. Boasting in the desires of his soul, the wicked, renouncing the Lord, there is no God. Your judgments are on high out of his sight, which is a way of saying I'm not accountable to anyone. I shall not be moved. Cursing, deceit, oppression, mischief, iniquity. Each of these describes, I think, a different part of the condition of human brokenness. You see, here's the thing: it's tempting for us, and it's actually easy for us to look at symptoms, whether it be, like I said, gun control, or is it mental illness? Those have a place, and I want to be clear about that. I think there's room for conversation on both of those things. But I don't think that they go deep enough. I believe that what we are seeing in our culture and in our context is a deep spiritual crisis that we are that we're only beginning to see the fruits of. We've created a culture in which life itself, not just physical life, but just life itself, we've created this mindset that it's really worthless and it's pointless. Life has no greater meaning. There's no sense of transcendence. There's no sense of awe and wonder. We're told to live for self. We're told to satisfy whatever our own personal desires and ambitions are. We've created a culture in which there's, if someone disagrees with you, they are the enemy. And so what happens is that begins to filter out, and we see people not as, people to disagree with or have a conversation with, but there's this hostility, there's this enmity, hatred between one another. Now, one of the things is that one of the challenges, or one of the pitfalls that we easily fall into, is that we tend to suppose that the problem is all out there, right? Like there's these, people that are really bad in the world, or there's people that are just, really evil and so on. They're the ones where the problem is, but it's never that simple. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a Russian, sort of a critic of the Russian government in the Soviet times, and he was eventually jailed. He was put in the work camps in the Gulag, and later on he wrote about that, and he made the penetrating observation that the line of good and evil runs through every human heart, and he said that in response to those who said, you've got the Soviet government, the oppressors, they are the bad ones, and everyone else is good. And he after even being the victim to that, he actually came to the conclusion that it's just not, it doesn't work like that. The power of sin and evil finds its home in every human heart. And now sometimes in varying degrees and sometimes in different ways, but that's the human condition, and we can't ever underestimate the power of evil in our world today. And that, we're seeing the fruit of that, and it shows itself in different ways. But I think this is the most fundamental explanation for all of this, is that the human heart is sinful and rebellious and hate and is capable of great evil. What is the response? What do we do with this as Christians? And I want to, again, the psalmist, I think, helps us to answer that. The psalmist does a couple things. First of all, there's a call to action here. Lift up your hand and forget not the afflicted. We call out to God on behalf of the oppressed. And if we do that, and as we do that, I believe that ought to help us ask the question, what might we do to to stand with those that God cares about, right? So there's the question there. There's the assurance that that God does see and note, and he takes it into his hands and he commits himself to the helpless. So there is this assurance that God is, even though it seems though God is far off, even though it seems that he is remote and inaccessible, he's in fact not. And there's a call here for God to act and to do justice, break the arm of the wicked and the evildoer. Again, we don't usually pray like this, and yet what the psalmist is doing is he's crying out to God that God might enact justice, that he might act against the power of evil in the world. And I think that's an appropriate prayer. It's a prayer for for justice to be done. The ultimate answer to this prayer, of course, is the cross. And I think, as from a Christian point of view, we have to ask the question: if the power of evil is so great and it lurks within every human heart, if that's the real problem, then the solution has to be big enough for that. And the solution, I think, says, even if it's ultimately, even if it doesn't answer every question, the cross says that God, number one, God did not exempt himself from victimhood. In other words, God stands with victims in such a way that he actually becomes like one of them. He enters into the experience of malice and hatred and hostility from people who wanted to kill him and in fact succeeded in killing him. So the cross says Jesus understands and experiences what the victims experienced on Tuesday, and experienced what parents experienced when they heard the most god-awful news of their kids. So there's that assurance, but there's also the experience that God has ultimately broken the arm of wickedness and evil, and he did that at the cross as well. I'll show you. The psalm goes on. And it talks about how God will, right, this final portion of the psalm. That God will do justice to the fatherless and the oppressed, so that man who is of earth may strike terror no more. Well, because of the cross, that will be realized one day. That is our ultimate hope, that one day, as the prophet Isaiah writes, swords will be turned into plowshares, and the instruments of violence and aggression and hostility will be turned into the instruments of cultivation. In the meantime, as Christians, we grieve and we weep with those who weep. We act, I think, according to our conscience. We ought to give thought to, what does it look like to try to work for a society that at least is, we can't bring heaven on earth, but at least maybe we can kind of bring a shadow of that until the day that it's fully realized. And so what does that look like? People who are wise in making policy and such are better at that than I could be. But we do so in the assurance that the Lord is king forever and ever. It doesn't always seem that way if we're honest with ourselves, right? The psalmist is honest. Sometimes it feels God is far off, he's hiding, and yet there's this assurance that God is king forever and ever. He has dealt the final and full blow against the power of sin and evil in our world. We will continue to pray for the community of Uvalde. We will, as a church, commit to that and seek God's mercy during these very, very difficult and tragic times. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.